I'm going to go ahead and start it. Thank you all for coming out here. Really appreciate it. I know some of you guys are here for extra credit, but that's cool. As long as you contribute to the discussion, it's all fine with me. My name is Renzo Diaz. I'm president of newly formed student org called Culturas WVU, Hispanic Latin American student org on campus, brand new. If you're interested, please join. Well, today we're here to discuss a panel called What It Means to Be Latino or Latina. And yeah, we'll get right to it. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves and their title on a little thing, anything they want to share. Starting from this side. Go ahead.
My name is Juan Guillermo Sanchez. I am from the Andes, Colombia, Bogota, big city in the south. I am professor in world languages and literature. I just arrived to this town, to this country, this state. So I'm happy to see you.
My name is Brandy Ledesma. I'm from Los Angeles, California, and I transferred here 3 years ago. I'm also a vice president of Culturas WVU and one of the founding members. I'm really excited that we're able to have a panel and get everyone involved.
Hi, my name is Brian Pine. I'm also a vice president of Culturas WVU and a co-founder. I'm the vice president of communications, to be exact. I'm a junior majoring in English, professional writing, and editing.
And I'm Michelle Stevens. I'm a professor of history, and I specialize in Latin America, specifically working on indigenous populations in Mexico and Central America. And this is my start of my third year at WVU. So, and I'm pleased to see a really nice turnout tonight.
Awesome, thank you very much. Alright, so that's the real following question. Any of you guys can start off. How do you identify yourself? And feel free to go, how do you identify yourself from start to end?
Yeah. So I was asking Renzo, like how many times, how long could I talk? Because for me it's a complex question, and so I'm gonna try to be brief. There are many ways to answer that question. In Latin America and anywhere, like I can think about race, I can think about nation, and I also would like to think about generation. So depends where I am. This is my experience. Identity changed. So there is a negotiation in the bottom of identity. So I think that, for instance, I can be mestizo, Mikey, how in Canada they talk about people that have different backgrounds, and one of them is indigenous people. But for instance, can be also native if I am in other places. Depends who I am with and who is looking at me. So this is interesting. Every time that we think that when we think about identity, we have to think about the place and the people. So I'm also a migrant. So it depends, where I am. If I'm in my own country, if I am in front of the officer of the United States, in the airport, I am this. But if I am there, it's different. So it's like, and there's also in my experience, like a generation that is searching and rethinking identity. So because I am from Bogota, and it's a place that is close to the Amazon, and many other places and forests that are full of indigenous knowledge. I have had the opportunity to grow, like experiencing and sharing with traditional medicine men and women, and that has created a different sense of identity. And it's not just me, but a lot of people in Chile, Mexico City, in Quito, in Bogota, and so there is identity that is growing and is related with that is trying to recuperate and that to reconnect with the native traditions that were like silent by the official history and colonial history. So there are a lot of like searchings in that way. So I think that is really complex, but I would say that the key word is negotiation.
Definitely. To add on to what he said, it really is hard to identify yourself when you come from so many different generations of different kind of Latin cultures. Like, my parents were born in Mexico, but I wasn't, and I consider myself Mexican American, where they consider themselves Mexican. And I'll go home and it's some because I'm out here, I lose a sense of my cultural identity being away from home. You lose that sometimes, so it is kind of hard to identify where you kind of stand. And like you said, it really depends on where you're at, because sometimes when I'm here, I just feel really American. But then when I'm home, I get my Mexican culture again, and I feel my heritage, and it feels great. But it's just hard to identify sometimes. So I am Mexican American, but it depends on how I've been integrated into my culture for however many years to really identify myself.
My parents are both from the Dominican Republic, and the Caribbean nations of Latin America are a little different because a lot of the almost all the indigenous population was wiped out by the colonization. For those of you that aren't super familiar with that, Christopher Columbus landed in the island of Hispaniola first, which is currently now Dominican Republic and Haiti. So, and that's where I'm from. So, there's not a lot of indigenous blood there, but there is a lot of European and African descent there. And so personally, I identify as Afro-Latino because my ancestors are from all over. I have a last name that is French, but my great-grandfather, the oldest living relative I met with that last name, was an African male. So you can see how in the Caribbean, especially in Dominican Republic, it's just so mixed, and there's all types of colors. So it's identity is something that's so complex within Latin America. But yeah, that's what I would say, Afro-Latino, because there is a huge black population within Latin America as well as there is a white population now. And nowadays you see all types of people in Latin America.
I am a white girl from New Jersey. And I had to email Brandy and say, like, just want to let you know, I'm not Latina. She said it was fine. I identify as an Irish, Italian, Spanish American. My grandparents were all born in Europe and came to America for a variety of reasons, mostly in the 20th century, some a little bit earlier. My mom's parents were Sicilian. My dad's parents and grandparents and so on and so forth, all the way back as far as anybody can tell, were either Irish or Scottish. It makes for interesting experiences while being in Latin America because I look more Mediterranean, and so I'm often mistaken for a Mexican of Spanish descent. And in fact, I have to correct people that no, like when you're asking me these random questions about where things are, assuming that I'm Mexican, I actually have no idea because I am not from there. But I was born and raised in a very multicultural family. My mother's aunt is Native American. She was born and raised on a reservation in Minnesota. My uncle is from Puerto Rico. So my background, in terms of my blood, if we want to consider that ethnic background, is European. My upbringing is extremely multicultural, and it allows me to be comfortable in a variety of settings in Latin America, where, particularly in Mexico, where my research is, it is a very multicultural society. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a girl from New Jersey, and my heritage is mostly Mediterranean and Irish.
Okay, so a lot of the panelists touched upon how the different influences throughout their life really dictates how you guys identify yourselves. So, what significance does diversity have in Latin American culture, and the different influences that have that influences many of the people there? Any of you guys can pick it up, and we can take it from there.
Okay. Well, I first and foremost believe that Latin America is the true melting pot of the world. It is where the Europeans first landed. It is or they first colonized. It is the beginning of the Americas as we know it today. So what significance does diversity have? I mean, there's not many places that get that diverse. My girlfriend's Guatemalan, but her descent is German, some indigenous, and also from Asia, and so you see in her alone, how many different cultures you can get in your ancestry just being Latin American. As for myself, I don't really know. There's not many records, of where my ancestors come from, but I do know just from history that my family comes from various different places. There's people that I know for sure. One of my great-grandparents came from Spain, and that's the only one I know for sure. But I can tell you that I have Spanish. There is African. There is likely French because of the huge French influence on Hispaniola, and so it's very different, I think, from many places in the world. There's no one set color for Latinos. I'm probably the whitest dude in my family. My little brother is a little darker than me. My mom's a little darker than that. We have all types of colors in my family alone, and that's for all types of Latin Americans. I mean, you can go all over Latin America and you find all colors and shapes and sizes and types of hair. People think we all have curly hair. My mom has very, very straight hair. It embodies diversity, I think. It's the region of the world that embodies diversity the most.
To feed off that really quickly, last summer I was on a research leave, and I decided my birthday would be well spent in Belize. And Belize, I think, embodies exactly what Ryan is explaining. In Belize, you have, particularly in northern Belize, but in the country as a whole, you have peoples of African descent, you have peoples of indigenous descent, you've got Mennonites, you've got European descent, and I've spent significant time in Mexico, particularly in Mexico City and Guadalajara, which are multicultural, very metropolitan cities. But I never experienced something like being in northern Belize, where you have, and Belize isn't a big country, and where I was is not a particularly big town. I mean, there are no big towns in Belize, really. But the place I was in had Asian immigrants, and who had come with the British traders back in the 19th century. And so I think Belize, in my travels, and they're not super extensive, but Belize is sort of this embodiment of precisely what Ryan is saying, this melting pot of cultures where on any given day you're seeing people whose ethnic backgrounds are extremely diverse, or you're in communities that have backgrounds that are extremely diverse. And that's not even getting into Mexico, which is a whole, we'll talk about that in a few weeks, so I'll pass it to someone else.
To add on to what Ryan's saying, I don't think people really understand sometimes how culturally diverse, like, being from Latin America or being from Spain really is. Like, I remember when I was little, my father tried really hard to make a family tree, and that was like the most difficult thing ever. We had family members, like, obviously they're from Mexico, so we started in Mexico, and then we ended up in Spain in our family tree, and then we somehow ended up in France, and then my mom's great aunt still speaks French, and she remembers growing up learning French, and I think that's really important for, if you were to take anything away from this, is that it's very, very culturally different, and some of my aunts had a French influence, and I mean, obviously I don't really look like your Mexican you see on a movie. I mean, that's what people, when I first came here, people thought I was Polish. I remember somebody asking me that. They were like, are you Polish? And I was like, no. But it's definitely what Ryan was saying. You think of these specific stereotypes to what you see in movies, and that's not at all what it's like. I'm the only person in my family who has green eyes. None of my other family members don't. And I have very fair skin, but my mom and dad don't. And then you look at my grandma, who's almost pale, but she spends almost all her day out in the sun. It's just different. It's a very big melting pot.
I was thinking also about Belize when you said you talk about diversity, because in Belize there is a community, the Garifuna community, where like it's a Afro-American community, but they speak an Arawak language. They speak an indigenous language. So it's like it's an Afro-indigenous community that is not just in Belize, but in Honduras, Guatemala, and other little islands in the Caribbean. So, like when you think about it, it's just so rich. You know, like diversity creates like these mixes that are beautiful. I was also thinking about this term that I read recently in this paper of the woman. She's Lipan Apache, but she calls herself Nde. And they live in the big water country. That's how they call it. That area between Mexico and United States in the south of Texas and Tamaulipas. So where these days there is a wall, and there are a lot of like colonizations that overlap, you know, the English, the Spanish, and etc. So, and she thought about this, instead to say universe, we should think about pluriverse, you know. And so that's how I see Latin America. And like I would like to bring on the table that Latin America, the term itself is problematic because it has many connotations. It was created in the 19th century and for like French scholars, and so like there is always like a deep reflection on these labels, and so not all this territory that we call Latin America is like directly connected with Spanish or English or French. There are places still in the Americas where they are monolingual in native language, for example. And so those reflections are necessary to think about diversity or pluriverse, like.
And I'd actually like to add on to that with some of the issues within that diversity, because they see many of the same issues we might see in America, but while in America it's more about like black and white, in Latin America it's colorism. there's still a glorification of the lighter skinned Latinos, and that is because of colonization and the history behind it. And the mind at this point is colonized to think that way. And so yeah, I just wanted to bring that on the table, that there is still issues. And it's crazy because personally in Dominican Republic, they're trying to get rid of the Haitians that have immigrated into Dominican Republic, and I just think that's crazy looking back at my family tree. Like, you know, that could have been any of my ancestors or people I know today, or people I've met and family I have in the Dominican Republic. Even people, Dominicans here in America are very dark skinned, so it's just crazy to me, like, how can they be deporting the Haitians because, you know, they're the blacker ones, you know, like they're the darker ones. And so yeah, it's important to realize that while it is very diverse and you see all types of colors, there are still issues of colorism, and that exists throughout all the Americas.
Just to add on to that really briefly, one of the first things I noticed when I went to Mexico City for the first time in 2008, I happened to be walking past a store and there was a wanted sign, and it said, "Se busca una persona de buena presentación." And so I was traveling with one of my mentors, and I said, well, what exactly does that mean? I'm not looking for a person who dresses well. And basically what he told me was the stores frequently in Mexico City, Guadalajara, will be looking for a person who's not Indian. So buena presentación has nothing to do with how you carry yourself, it has everything to do with your skin color. And I found that appalling in 2007 when I was there. That in a country that is so diverse and has so many different indigenous groups, and I think 65 indigenous languages that are recognized by the Mexican government, that was something that was sort of the focal point of people who were doing job hiring. Since I've been there several times in the past couple of years, you no longer see those signs, and instead you see we respect the rights of all people, of all creeds, of all colors, of all religious backgrounds, and so on. So there's been a bit of a shift in the last few years, but it was one of the sort of interesting things that is burned in my memory from my first trip to Mexico City.
How about you guys, the crowd? Do you guys have any questions? Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Lucette Hernandez. I'm a librarian here at Evansdale Library, and I'm Puerto Rican. I have taken a DNA test. I am 20% Native American, I am 40% African, and only 40% European, and I look just like this. In my community, we are all different colors. My grandmother was born white, her mother was black. Her father was black. Brothers and sisters were black. She was the only one that was born with white skin. I'm allowed to celebrate my Africanness and my Native Americanness within my own community, but when I deal with people that are North American and I tell them, hey, I'm nearly half African, they don't believe me. I'm not allowed to participate. I'm not allowed to enjoy or revel in my culture. There's a part of me that I have to restrain because of the way I look in Western society. And I think what you said gave me chills on the back of my neck because you are our youth. Thank you very much for saying that. And you can talk till you're blue in the face and nobody will believe you. They say, no, in this country you have to choose your identity. You have to choose being Native American. You can't choose being African. And you have to choose being white. I can't, because that's being disrespectful for the people that died. The mountain of skulls from the Taino. If you've ever seen those horrible pictures, I'm a descendant of that. You're forcing me to choose which box I should fit in, but I can't. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else with a question? Yeah?
Yeah, so it goes back to your very first question. I'm Shanad, also a librarian, who rock, by the way, CEO. You asked, how do you identify? And I've been doing some work on microaggression, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with. In a nutshell, it's how you say little things that you don't think are offensive, but they're so ingrained in who you are and our culture, but they are. Like, I can walk up to you and say, hey, what are you? Trying to find out your ethnicity, which would be very rude of me. I'd never say that. How do you guys, what advice can you give for people on more socially, culturally sensitive ways to find out someone's ethnicity or cultural identification?
I can definitely deal with that. When I first transferred here, my roommate was not too fond of me being from Mexico, Mexican descent, so that was very difficult to deal with. And she had all these stereotypes about Mexicans and how they should act, and it was very hard for me to deal with because I'd never been to the East Coast at all until I transferred, and I had all these great ideas. I'm going to do so many great things being away from home, and then it just felt so crushed when people started treating me different just because of that. Not because of my skin. I mean, obviously you can't tell, but the minute I said it, it was like, oh, really? And then different questions came out, and then but my roommate did have a lot of microaggressions towards me, and it was just little things like I was taking Spanish here. I mean, my parents are both native Spanish speakers, but I'm not. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. When I was born in LA, that's when the whole Rodney King riots were going on, so they didn't want me or my brother to be treated differently in school, so they didn't want us to have the accent, so they just didn't even bother trying to teach us Spanish. So I didn't grow up speaking Spanish, but I can understand it. So when I decided to take Spanish here, it was like I want to connect back with my culture, so I had a Spanish class one day and I was studying in the living room, and she came up to me and she was like, how don't you know Spanish? Aren't you born speaking it? Like just little stuff like that. And I was just like, really? Or like just little things like, can you cook for us? I know you know how to cook. Your family, you know how to cook.
You must know how to dance.
Yes, like
And baseball.
Teach me how to salsa. It's like
Baseball and soccer.
yeah, it's just like little things. Like I'm not very coordinated. Like I play water sports, but not other sports. I'm not coordinated. And my friends one time had asked me to play soccer with them, like on the rec, like in the rec center, and I sucked. And it was just like they were like, I thought you were Mexican. How do you suck? And it's just like it's little things like that. I mean, I brush them off just because I just do. I mean, it doesn't bother me, but to me, it's just kind of like we're in 2015. Like, how do you have these stereotypes of what everybody should do, what everybody should think? Like, I don't know how to play soccer. I'm sorry, but it does get to me. I would have to call my parents and like be like, okay, like how do I would try. I'm not rude. I'm not a rude person. I never had like a confrontation, but like I did have to say one time like, okay, I don't know if you're joking or if you're being serious, but that kind of hurt. I mean, it's just little stuff. I know what you mean by microaggressions.
And I just wanted to point out what you said, and you might not have heard her. You don't ask what are you, what is your ethnicity, is the correct thing to do in all situations. Don't ask what are you, because what are you, a human? So yeah, very important, very important. And that's not, it's not like you can totally blame a person for asking what are you, because race is a very touchy subject, and that's where those microaggressions come from, and it's something that is subconscious at this point. Like I said, the mind has been colonized. There's always history to it. You don't have to consciously be thinking racist things to act racist or to be racist or anything, any type of anything. It's subconscious. You have to be able to accept the fact that I consider myself an activist, and regardless of that, I could still find myself being prejudiced in some which way or form because that's subconscious. The solution here is to realize that it's subconscious, that you're doing it whether you want to or not, and to work on that. Because it's almost, people argue like I'm not racist, but we're born and raised being taught these stigmas and these a lot of times lies about race. And stereotypes, so it's important to recognize that it's more subconscious at this point than anything, because a lot of people think, racial issues are over, but it's not. It's a subconscious battle at this point.
All right, so we've talked about our differences, how Latin American people, Hispanic people are separated in terms of labels and whatnot, but in Latin American culture. What are some of the similarities that make up the Latin American culture? What are the things that make up Latin American cultures, and And
Well, I was thinking about it and like, so I think this is the time that we are remembering roots of exchange. So I'm thinking about corn. Because that makes us equal. So there is a diet that crosses the entire continent, or continents, how you think about it. So the Americas is crossed by corn and beans and squash. And that means that there is there are old roots of migration, you know, that goes beyond like the Spanish colonization, and Spanish English settlement and all that. So I feel that one of the assignments for our generation is to remember roots of exchange, because we were diverse even before the Spanish and English and French, etc. And so the migration routes are really important to rethink that. Maíz, which is a Taino word, you know, maíz means the same in Taino, and Anishinaabe, the language of the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe. So when you start making those connections based on language, on diets, on beliefs, we stop thinking about difference and we start thinking differently, you know. So I think that food is really important to think these days, and I wanna bring it.
Any of you guys?
I would say one big similarity that I see it strongly in Latin American culture, but I feel like it's in every culture, is family. Family brings everyone together. It's a huge thing. What makes everybody similar in every culture, no matter where you're from, is you're always going to have respect and love for your family. That strong family tie.
Of course, a similarity and difference at the same time. The official language of Latin American countries would be Spanish. They speak different forms of it. There's different vernaculars and accents. And so, for example, as a Dominican, coño means damn, but like I've heard a lot of different people think a lot of different things, and like, you know, I mean, that's just, you know, I don't know why, but there are different dialects and vernaculars, as I said, and accents. And some countries speak in vos. If you've seen this new show Narcos, has anybody seen that? They say a lot of times, instead of saying tú, which you guys are learning in your Spanish class, or usted, they say vos, and that's just a different form of Spanish. It's just the way they speak. So you see how they've taken, like, you know, what was installed there and transformed it to be their own. So while we all speak Spanish and can generally all understand each other, there are differences, and sometimes somebody may struggle, especially, I mean, being Dominican, we speak fast and kind of like choppy, and I have, you know, like, I have been in instances where people have trouble understanding me, or tell me they have trouble understanding Dominicans, but for the most part, you can always grasp it.
Really quickly adding on to that's exactly what my parents told me. Because I was learning Spanish here, but the Spanish you learn here is like textbook Spanish. Yeah, and then I would speak it at home with my parents, and they didn't learn that. So.
Well, because no Mexican lisps their C's and
no,
C's, and when you do that in Mexico, they look at you like you're crazy. But then you go to Spain, because I learned textbook Spanish, but my Spanish is more influenced by my time in Mexico, and so the Spanish said to me, "You speak like a Mexican." I'm like, I'm gonna take that as a compliment. I don't care how you mean it, because they shouldn't say I sound like an American, which
Yeah, when I would try to speak Spanish, like what I learned in the textbook back home with my grandma, she'd be like, look at me and be like, "This stupid." She wouldn't understand what I was trying to say, or she'd make fun of the way I was saying it, because that's not how they say it. But it's just, I love that.
And I think part of that, as someone who studies indigenous cultures, part of that is all of Spanish, no matter where you are, is influenced by other things. So the example I always give my students is in Mexico, you want to call, you're talking about an owl, right? It's tecolote. You go to Spain and you say tecolote, or you go anywhere else, I think, in Latin America, you say tecolote, and you're just like, okay, yes, tecolote. That's an owl, but it's Aztec, so fine. And the one thing that I wanted to say is someone sort of from the outside looking in is all of Latin America to me is syncretism. So syncretism is the blending of two things, typically talked about in the case of religion, but I think in the case of culture it also works. So no matter where you are in Latin America, the culture that you're seeing on the ground is a blend of something, right? It's a blend of the indigenous that was present. It's a blend of the European, the many Europeans that came Spanish first, or in the case of Brazil, the Portuguese, forgetting about Brazil. It's a blending of the African. It's a blending of American influence. Whether Latin Americans like it or not, I think Americans have influenced Latin America in particularly negative ways, but it's not true for us, I'm not going to get into that. So when I look at Latin America, everywhere I go, regardless of what country I happen to be in, I see this syncretism, this blending. Even in the most, what we would sort of consider traditional indigenous communities, they have blended some element of the outside culture. In the case of the people I study, they mostly don't speak Spanish. They're mostly not Catholic or Catholicized. But you see elements of that because that's just how human communities are. They incorporate things as they see fit. And so to me, Latin America is an example of this perfect, well, not always perfect, but generally perfect syncretism of many, many cultures, which makes it antiquated and somewhat problematic, and it makes it that cosmic race. I can't even believe we're doing that.
Speaking of Latin America, you have Brazil, which takes up about half of Latin America. How do these people identify themselves? Hispanic, or and Brazil obviously has a large Afro population also.
Yeah.
How do these people, like in general, are they Hispanic, or are they just, how do the non-Afro ones tend to identify themselves? Because they would probably just say, oh yeah, I'm African, or I'm African descent, or I'm black. But how would the non-Afro Brazilians identify? Like, you know, how most non-Afro Hispanic people would say, I'm Hispanic. What would they call themselves?
Yeah, I can't even claim to say how, because I sort of wish we had, there's three professors in Brazil, but yeah, go ahead.
Ellen.
Okay, perfect.
Well,
Well,
represent the So I am originally from Brazil. I identify myself as Afro-Brazilian because of African ancestry. Your question was about, okay, people who do not identify with their African heritage, how they identify themselves. And most of the people that I know would say Latinos, not necessarily Hispanics, because of the language. They would say that Hispanics primarily would speak Spanish or belong to countries that were colonized by Spanish. And Brazil was colonized by the Portuguese. So, but since we are in Latin America, and since we have to check a box, and the box in the US puts together Hispanic/Latino, just like with Asians, they put people from India and China together, and cultures completely different. And so I would identify myself as Latina, but not necessarily as a Hispanic.
So it's Latino.
Yes, does it make sense?
Thank you very much.
yeah, thank you.
The term Hispanic has ties to the colonizers. So some people prefer Latino to Hispanic because it's you know, stepping away from that from the history of the colonization.
I'm gonna ask one more question and then I'll open it up to questions from the crowd. This is a little different from the before questions. So from your perspective, panelists, how do you think Latinos are transforming politics in the United States today?
Well, as someone who's sort of intensely interested in politics, I don't, again, because I don't identify as Latino, I don't know exactly how they're transforming politics, except that I can say, I think politicians take Latin Americans for granted as if they are one enormous group of monolithic people that just happen to all speak Spanish or Portuguese in some cases. And my example for that is a very good friend of mine who identifies as Chicano, who was enraged by the Democrats' unwillingness to do anything about undocumented workers. And so I kind of poke at him and see, like, but are Republicans any better? And I'll for all intents and purposes, I'm a leftist. I find serious problems with both parties. But I started to understand how he felt as a person who identified as Latino, who believed firmly that both political parties take Latin Americans for granted. The Democrats take for granted that Latin Americans will show up because if they don't, the alternative's worse. And I think that's seriously problematic. And I think that's seriously problematic when we think about any sort of ethnic bloc, politically speaking.
And and just an example of putting a bunch of them all into one group. It kind of is the inspiration behind this whole panel in general, was to teach about the diversity within Latin America, because they're not just all one group. And look at today, like Donald Trump just refers to Mexicans left and right, but he's talking about all Latinos and Hispanics and anybody from Latin America. And it's an issue because I don't know how you couldn't care about the Latino vote when it's the fastest growing population. So Latinos have a huge say in the votes. They can be a huge deciding factor. And they have a huge influence on American culture now. I mean, you go to any major city and you're gonna find lots of Hispanic culture and Latino culture, or any type of Latin American culture. I mean, any major city in the U.S. I mean, if you could see a Latino population growing in Morgantown, that could tell you what it must be like in New York. That's exactly what we're trying to get away from.
Yeah, we don't
Just kidding. This side.
They kind of said what I was thinking. It's basically I was going to say basically the same thing as like Ryan said. Like it's they're being represented everywhere now. Like I remember like going to different little places when I was growing up, and there was no culture, no Hispanic, Latino representation culture there, and now there is, and that makes me happy. But I mean, I'm happy that our nation is becoming more diverse itself, and I feel like we're all starting to move forward toward accepting those differences. I mean, not completely, not 100% yet. I mean, look at all the candidates running on both sides. Like, we're not there yet, but I'm hoping that we will be. But they kind of stopped at the beginning, I was going to say.
Yeah, well, I just arrived to the States, so I don't know, I don't understand much about politics here. But I do know that there are conservative Latinos and there are like more like liberal Latinos, and it depends on their places where they migrate. So I was living in Canada, in London, Ontario, for 4 years, where I made my PhD, and I used to call this place Londombia because it's full of Colombians. But there was a migration before the Colombians, that it was people from El Salvador. So the people that came from El Salvador, they came as refugees, and the majority of them were fighting with the guerrilla. So they arrived to Canada, and of course they are left from the left. They support the left party and the liberals and stuff. The Colombians that were there, that arrived in the 90s, they came escaping from the guerrilla or like war, civil war that we have been forever. But they were more conservative, you know. So when there were like meetings and manifestations and marches and stuff, I saw how, you know, like it was like completely different people. Like it's not. So I don't understand. I don't identify myself as a Latino, and I think that like every time that I have to feel to mark that box, I say this is wrong, you know. And I think that I will continue feeling that way. So it's hard to answer the question because there is no such a one party that supports Latino. Like this is different. The Cubans is different. The Puerto Ricans is different. It's just different. So, yeah.
Questions? Comments?
Yeah. So we have Rubio, you have Ted Cruz, you have Marco Rubio, you have Ted Cruz, two mega right Republican Hispanics. Rubio is like Cuban, of Cuban descent, and Cruz is Hispanic. I don't know what he is.
He's Cuban. He's of Cuban descent.
Cuban Irish.
Both of them.
Yeah.
Okay. So just how do you feel about their kind of just their take on immigrants, considering they have a deep immigrant background? How do you feel about their take on that? We know, Rubio particularly wants to crack down on immigration. Of course, unlike Trump, he's actually aware that they're not all Mexicans. According to Trump, the vast majority of illegal immigrants are all Mexicans. And of course, Rubio had to come and say, no, you're wrong. So how do you feel about the more right side, right-wing spectrum of Hispanics? How do you think their role is going to play in the conservative side? Just in general, just the panel in general, if anybody has any views on that.
Me personally, my sister-in-law is Mexican. She actually has the exact same name as me. Her name is Michelle Stevens. It's really bizarre. She is what in some in Southern California call a self-hating Mexican. She is someone of Mexican descent who detests her Mexican ethnicity. Her mother was born in Mexico. My sister-in-law was raised in Southern California. And she will frequently, this if I can get sort of a sense of the far right-wing, at least Mexican perspective on immigration, it's that they, meaning those who came here, and this is, again, not true of all Mexicans, but this very, very conservative mindset of Mexicans is that they came here and they did it right, they did it legally, and Mexicans who are migrating now without papers are wrong. And the case in point is, my sister-in-law once said to me, and this was after I'd probably been in Mexico for 2 years, she said to me, don't go down to the Walgreens on Beach Boulevard because that's where all the wetbacks hang out. And I was just like, what are you saying? You're Mexican, your kids are Mexican. But she completely divorces that part of her. And it's not, it isn't a thing. It's not part of her identity at all, even though she checks the box as Latina. My nieces and nephews will check the box as Latino and Latina. She is part of a sort of, I don't want to say odd because I'm placing judgment then, and I don't want to do that, but she's part of a community that views Mexican immigrants who come without papers as inherently bad and wrong, and sort of divorces herself from her own culture in doing so.
So you think that's probably what Rubio and Cruz are probably focusing on?
Rubio, and I don't want to bogart this entire conversation, but Rubio, one of the stories that he tells about his family is that his family escaped Castro's Cuba, and in fact, that sort of gives him some right-wing credentials in the right-wing political sphere of the United States. In fact, his family came before Castro took over Cuba. So, what does that mean? I mean, I know Cubans who are left wing, I know Cubans who are right wing. I don't know if it's something in his personal background, not his ethnic background, of course, but his personal background that makes him believe the way that he does towards immigrants. But I mean, I find it sort of hugely problematic.
I would also add on that a lot of Latinos may have conservative views because of religion. Religion plays a huge role into Latin American culture, widely Catholic Christian community, and that leads to politics. That may be changing.
It's everywhere, you know. Like when you think about like politics, like when you talk about Latino, let's stop talking about Latino. Religion is still. So like that's another like thing that is important like to think about. You know, like it's everywhere because go. No, sorry. Go ahead. No, it's okay.
I was just gonna say that I was finishing there. Just that religion does play a major part of it. That may be changing now. You see a lot more liberals, especially like people that still identify as Latino but might have been born here. I think tend to be more liberals. Or I mean, I don't want to say that because I don't really know, but at least me in my experience. But I do want to hear what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I was thinking just about that about religion because like no, just that. Sorry, just wanted to clarify that is also present in the conversation outside Latino and Latin American. So, but because that's part also of the stereotypes. Because when we think about Latin America, like the thing is that if we try to talk about Latin America, we start talking about like but someone in the audience doesn't identify as a Latino, but wants to think about Latin America, you are going to start thinking about yourself. Because when we talk about the other, we are talking about ourselves. So that's something that is reflecting something, and so that's the comment about, because all the things that we are talking about are related also with your own identity.
From your own perspective.
Sorry?
From your own perspective, you're talking about perspective. So everything you try to relate to, you're relating it from your own standpoint, point of view, in that sense.
Yeah, because like identity is like it's a concept from psychology, from clinical psychology. When you try to identify yourself, you have to find a difference with the other. So it's like there is always a dialectic movement, So everything that we are thinking about Latin America is also related with our beliefs or ways to think about everything. So it's like.
Thank you. Ellen?
Yes, I would like to challenge the framework that associates Latinos with outsiders, with immigrants, because the Chicanos, or what people would call today Mexicans or Mexican descendants, they are the founding fathers of this nation with Native Americans. They were here before any Anglo citizen. And that when we talk about politics, this is a community that is highly politicized. But if you look for a political meeting, you won't find. But if you go to a cookout, to someone's house, you'll see politics being made there on a daily basis. And it's politics of oppression, politics of community, of engagement, and a community that is highly democratic, that saw the values of partnerships and also the differences within different societies that existed in the United States hundreds of years ago. So descendants of this community were killed, were expelled, and a wall was built and they were told, you don't belong here, now you are an outsider, and now you will live where you are. And any social, financial issue caused by me against your nation is your problem. And if you try to come here, I will keep pushing you out, unless if I need you for my financial sustainability. And in this history, people have been crossing borders, and they are back and forth, and we keep seeing and labeling them as outsiders, even when they were citizens. And we know in the history, like American citizens, Mexican descendants, being expelled from their own houses. And I highly recommend one documentary from PBS called Latino Americans that also tells a little bit of this story. But my comment is just like to see the Latinos as actually not only a community that is enhancing diversity, because if we don't see them, it's because perhaps they were there before, but they were pushed away. And see them as the founding fathers, not the outsiders.
Anyone from the crowd want to comment on that? Panelist?
I think a great example of what you're talking about is the Nuevo Mexicanos. So the Nuevo Mexicanos who've been here for 500 years, all of a sudden in 1848, with the end of the Mexican-American War, are now forced. You choose your nationality. You either go to Mexico and be Mexican, which means you uproot your family from where they've been living for probably 250 years or so, or you can become American, but yet still be treated as outsiders because of your ethnic background. And so I appreciate your comment, because I think in our own history, it's something that's not taught. It's particularly not taught in this part of the country, but it is taught. I did my PhD in Oklahoma, and sort of that southwestern history is taught. The idea that we expelled American citizens of Mexican descent in the 1930s rings true, but if we go back a little bit further than that, the idea that because national boundaries changed, all of a sudden that made people outsiders who've been living in this land for centuries. And I think that's hugely problematic.
On the heels of that, with the Mexicans, I've lived out west, and it's interesting because you'll find them, not a lot, but some of them will clarify for you. Oh, I'm not Mexican descent, I'm New Mexican.
Yep.
Which I've always just been kind of like,
Nuevo Mexicano is kind of like Tejano too. It's a very particular identity of, if we want to use Latino as an umbrella term, Nuevo Mexicano or Tejano or Chicano is a very, very particular identity within this broader Latino identity.
I just kind of like to take a different standpoint on it. I'm from here. I'm from Morgantown. Was born here. Been here my entire life. I've never really had to think about how I identify and what people consider me. And it's just very interesting, eye-opening to see that all of you have that multicultural, influence on your life. And like, I have the influence from everyone that comes to Morgantown. And I get to see the different aspects of it, and it's really interesting to me because like I am interested in the Mexican culture and the Latino culture, and I would eventually like to be fluent in Spanish and just learn all these different things from you guys because your culture is so diverse in many different aspects. And it's just interesting to see that from you guys.
so if you were in Europe and someone looked at you, they're going to obviously assume that you're American. But if they ask you how you identify, how would you respond?
I would probably just say white American, maybe Native American, Caucasian. I mean, my family, some of my ancestors are from Ireland. So you could argue that I'm Irish, but I'm a little bit of everything. My family, what we call a Heinz 57. I'm Scottish, Indian, Polish, Irish. Like I have a huge cultural diversity within myself, but I would only really identify as being white American.
So step back and think, I think you said it on the very end, you should be able to see how we said we're all kind of the same, right? We're all kind of nuts. We're all this crazy.
We are all.
So I think it's important that you, as you put ourselves in a box, which sounds very difficult for you two out there. But we're more than just a box, all of us. So.
There is
I was just saying that I was very inspired by how you guys, with your upbringing and all of that, and your cultures.
Thank you very much. We are at the time of closing,